Good afternoon, everybody. We're very thankful and glad that you guys have tuned in today for our Integrated Parasite Management with Sheep webinar. And we hope that you will benefit from this and we can all go forward together as producers and educators and researchers to control the barber pole worm. Let's see, I got to advance this thing here. This webinar is brought to you with funding by Western Sustainability Agriculture Research and Education grant. It's been a 3-year project and it has featured applied research by Dr. Whit Stewart and Tom Murphy, who used to be at Montana State University, and their research was focused on the incidence of barber pole worm in sheep flocks in Montana and Wyoming, and also the resistance of dewormers to the barber pole worm within those sheep flocks. The second component of the project was to provide outreach to agricultural educators, veterinarians, 4-H leaders, FFA leaders, to get knowledge about the barber pole worm out to producers and students. This 3-year project is ending this December, and this is the last training that we're going to have. There's been 10 trainings so far, and we're hoping that the 25 educators that we've trained thus far before this webinar will carry on this work. Oops, sorry guys, wrong way. Just a little bit about my background. I milked cows along with my wife and kids for about 21 years, and in 2003 we switched to raising sheep, largely because our kids left home, and Jenny and I finally figured out that if we were going to see our kids, we'd have to not milk cows anymore. So that's why we switched to sheep. We've had 200 ewes since 2003, and we immediately put them onto our 32 acres of irrigated pasture. And after a few years of sailing right through things with no problems, third and fourth year and beyond, we started running into all kinds of barber pole worm problems. We didn't even know what it was at first. We just had dead lambs out there in the pasture. And so we've come from that point to the next 17 years of experiencing what you can do to control the barber pole worm. And that information we are going to try to present to you today. We have a diversified approach. We have 2 producers and 2 researchers and ag educators. And so we're hoping that we can really get the goods to you today. This is a 2.5-hour long webinar, and it'll be about 2 hours of classroom instruction and about a half an hour long of instruction on how to do Famacha. At the end of this whole webinar, we're going to give you a chance. If you want a Famacha card, you're going to have to send me a video of yourself demonstrating the correct Famacha scoring technique. And after that, I will send you a certificate and a Famacha card. We have 40 Famacha cards available. And so those first 40 that send me in a video demonstrating their technique, they're going to get a Famacha card for free. After that, I'm sorry, but you'll have to pay $20. So I also work as a livestock specialist for NCAT, National Center for Appropriate Technology, and it's been my privilege the last 8 or so years working for them, contributing to publications, videos, podcasts, all about livestock and grazing. So, integrated parasite management. That's the subject of the webinar, and we can see in this slide that it involves sheep from all phases of the production cycle, from lambing to, that's the little inset picture on the right-hand top corner. That's the barber pole worm L3 larvae. They are not visible by the naked eye, but with just a little hand lens, you can pick them up. And as evidenced by this left-hand picture, this is how you get the barber pole worm. It's from putting a lot of sheep on a small acreage paddock. In this picture, there's about 600 or 600 sheep per acre, and that is what we have done in order to maximize the lamb production per acre. The bottom picture is the Famacha card, and it is integral to integrated parasite management. Just want to have a short shout out to the ATTRA program. ATTRA is the name of NCAT's extension, and so we have a lot of resources on sheep and goats. We have resources on regenerative grazing, horticulture, just about all facets of sustainable agriculture. They are all free downloads, and you can get those downloads, find out about us by checking out attra.ncat.org, or to make it simpler, just Google ATTRA and we'll come up. This webinar is based on 5 ATTRA integrated parasite management tip sheets that were developed for the project. The names of them are frequently asked questions about integrated parasite management, how fecal egg counts can help you fight parasites, why Famacha score, and graze to control parasites, and simple genetic selection strategies to manage your flock. So this is the backbone of this webinar, and if you have any questions, feel free to download those tip sheets. Again, they are free on the ATTRA site. Also, check into your state sheep extension. They're here to help you, and they have a lot of resources available to them, and a lot of times they are very knowledgeable in practical sheep husbandry. So we have in Montana, Brent Rader. In Wyoming, Dr. Whit Stewart, who is joining us on this webinar today. In Utah, there is Dr. Chad Page. In Idaho, there is Dr. Melinda Ellison, and she is also on this webinar today. So use your sheep extension agents. It's one of the best programs going in the United States. Another resource is the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. Their website is wormex.info. There's a tremendous amount of information on the barber pole worm here on this website, and actually I have used them extensively in our journey through the barber pole worm the last 17 years. And so I really urge you to take a look at their website. You can ask questions to them and they'll get you answers, so it's a really great website. Okay, down to the subject at hand. We're going to start out with what, as sheep producers, we already have a pretty good feeling for the potential of sheep production on irrigated pastures. And irrigated pastures is going to be the focus today. For those of you that might be joining us from the Midwest and East with your rainfall pastures, it definitely applies because you've got 20, 25 plus inches of rain. But we're focusing on particular the pastures involved in the Intermountain West, which are irrigated. And the great potential that sheep have as a productive unit on these pastures is they can wean the way to mama. And you think about that for a while. Can cattle do that? They can't even come close. You know, a ewe that's a 150-pound ewe, she can, in 120 days on grass, she can wean two twins, or a twin set of twins that's each one is 70 pounds. If all goes well, cattle on the same number, it takes them 200 plus days to wean half the cow's weight. So that's why in Montana, and I think other states too in the Intermountain West, ranchers were settled and paid for by sheep, and the basic principle still applies today. So we can be glad for that potential. We just have to realize how we can make it work for us. There's one big problem.
Dave, you went mute. No.
How's that?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Must have sat on the headset thing there. So at this time, I'd really like to introduce Dr. Melinda Ellison. She is a sheep producer herself, and she's also an extension sheep specialist at the University of Idaho. So she's one of us, and she has done a lot of grazing research and interactions of animals on grass. And so we welcome Melinda. Take it away, Melinda.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so my role here is to tell you guys a little bit about all the different types of parasites that we are going to be talking about today and how we can identify and target them better. So the very first thing is, oh boy, I'm going. Let me go back. Okay. Oh. I'm sorry, I have a jumpy mouse today, I guess. So obviously parasites can be one of the major problems for sheep and goats. Anybody who raises sheep and goats already knows that, especially if you're grazing on anything that is wet. I came to Idaho from Laramie, Wyoming, and everything I grazed there was high prairie, dry. And I get to Idaho, and the first thing that happens is my sheep start having major parasite issues, right? So I get it. It's really a pain to deal with, and it's not always easy to know what to do. And certainly you start to have losses in your critters that you don't understand or have a hard time figuring out how to work through that. So the biggest thing about parasites is you really have to think about it, unfortunately, because it causes a lot of problems if they are parasitic. I mean, you can have changes in milk production, breeding performance, growth, but most of this comes from having issues with nutrient, poor nutrient uptake, and also it can affect some of their vitamin and mineral balance within their body, and so that's the main reason that you're seeing some poor performance in the animals. And so sheep are definitely the most susceptible, but anytime you have animals eating grass close to the ground, which I think we're going to get into a little bit later about why that is the case, but they also are more willing to graze near their fecal pellets, and they have a hard time developing that immune system. So you're gonna have problems with your sheep and goats at some point. The hard part with this issue is that the anthelmintics or the dewormers that are available right now, there are not very many that are approved for sheep and goats, first of all. They take a long time to develop, and we're starting to see some real issues with resistance. So we have to be able to integrate different types of control for parasites to be able to be the most effective. So the barber pole worm, or the Haemonchus contortus, I'm going to mostly just call it barber pole from here on out, but this is the most common worm in the Intermountain West especially, and this guy is called a barber pole worm, as you can see, because of the stripes in it. The red is the blood, and the white is the thousands of eggs that are in that little tiny critter. And it attaches to the wall of the abomasum there in the stomach of the animal, and they primarily survive through sucking blood in the sheep and goat. And so what ends up happening is the animals become anemic, and the adult lifespan of each worm is 7 to 8 months. So you can imagine that it just continually causes problems. And adult worms in the animal can be up to 100 within one animal. So with this one, anemia is a big problem. It can cause death, of course, if they get too severe. You'll see a lot of pale mucous membranes, and this is where the Famacha scoring is going to be important. You can sometimes get edema or a bottle jaw. This one does not cause diarrhea typically, and so if you're seeing that in your animals, it's probably not the barber pole. But they just become poor doers, and sometimes they just will up and die. And if you know that that's what's going on, you want to make sure you're at least attempting to control it in some fashion, but it is difficult to control. So being able to look in the eyelid for the Famacha scoring or the level of anemia that's happening in those animals is the only way to really know what's happening. And you might have an animal that looks really bad like this one or this one, and they might score pretty well, which means something else is probably going on. Or you can have a really healthy animal that scores poorly and she can suddenly die. And so one of the things you want to make sure you're doing is at least understanding how this works and being able to identify what type of parasite that you have. So the barber pole worm has a short direct life cycle. It proliferates quite a heavy amount, so it's hard to hit and get all of the worms at a time. And they can go into the hypobiotic state during winter and can survive also on pasture for a long time. And so these critters are just getting really good at being resistant to various things that we have to throw at them. Oh. So there's also other different types of gastrointestinal worms. They're roundworms as well. These other ones don't cause the anemia that you'll see with the barber pole, and they're not usually quite as common. They also burrow into the wall of the abomasum or intestines, but they're usually not quite as big of a challenge as far as the animal being able to maintain and perform, but they can be additive. So if you have the barber pole worm and some of these other types of worms, you could have some really big problems coming your way. So the other one that we have trouble with sometimes is the coccidia, which is actually a protozoa, not a roundworm, and they don't cause anemia either, but these are the ones that you'll see a lot of scouring, and it's sometimes the bloody scouring, so it'd be really dark coming out. So this one, once they're infected, the symptoms start to occur in 2 to 3 weeks. And if you let it go too long, you're going to have a hard time being able to come back from it. So when you're having issues like this, if you're seeing your critters having some runny diarrhea, especially if they're out on pasture and it just doesn't seem like the right time of year to be having problems, they're probably got a coccidia problem. And so you can use coccidiostats to balance that out a little bit and help them out. So I actually had a ewe this spring that had a problem with this, and I treated her for a couple weeks and she came out of it and she's doing great now. So it is doable. And you can also test for coccidia using a fecal egg count, but it may or may not describe the virality of the infection. So one of the things that I think is the most important with the coccidia infection is to make sure that when you're having your sheep and goats, especially in smaller areas, making sure that you keep everything clean and don't crowd them too much and give them a chance to stay healthy that way. So if you're in an area where coccidia is a problem, one of the things you can do is use additives that might help keep that disease at bay a little bit. So there's a few options listed here that you can apply to feed mineral or water. If you have individual animals that come up with the scours that are related to coccidia, you can treat them with amprolium, which is one of the, the corid that you can get over the counter from your vet. Oh, I see this note here that I didn't notice earlier. I didn't realize this either. So toxic to horses and other equids. So something to keep in mind. Okay, so why do we have problems with this? The deal is these critters live in the pasture, and 80% of the worms that you're gonna see are out in the pasture. So the sheep and goats will ingest that L3 infective larvae, and then as those worms get older and become L4s, they're going to become those bloodsuckers, which is 20% inside the animal themselves. You also have to consider that as you're grazing, you have animals that are more susceptible, especially to the detrimental effects of having these parasite issues. So anytime you have young lambs, if they're just weaned, maybe they don't have a mother, yearlings, if they're making lots of babies all at once, and once they're older, obviously the old ladies are going to have more trouble than your regular mature animals. So this is pretty much standard for almost any disease, but it's just something to remember when you're trying to make progress with what you've got in your block. And I believe that's the end of mine for a minute.
Okay, I'll come on again. Are you guys hearing me? Okay, great. Okay, so crucial to the whole understanding of how we can manage the barber pole worm to control it is its life cycle. And it's a pretty simple life cycle, but we can really do some really great management using this life cycle. So let's just start with it with the adult worms inside the sheep. They are sucking blood and they are making thousands of eggs a day. And then those eggs are put into the sheep pellets. They're deposited onto the pasture. And then within 4 to 9 days, those eggs hatch into what's called the L3 larvae stage or the infectious stage, and they assume a perch on the grass leaf. So it only takes them 4 to 9 days to go from the pellet to the leaf. That's going to be very important in our grazing strategies, as we'll talk about later. Once they are ingested by the sheep, it takes 18 days to go from the L3 larvae stage to the L4 and adult stage. We're saying L4 because L4 larvae, they can go into hypobiosis, which is just another name for hibernating inside the ewe, or they can just become an adult right away. So we're going to use these critical number of days to manage these through grazing. So remember then, it takes about 27 days on the outside for the life cycle to be complete. And just an example of how we can use that information is if we're running our sheep into paddocks, changing them so that we make a full rotation of our pasture, just say in 22 days. And I'm speaking from personal experience because when we went from dairy cows to sheep, we figured whatever was good for dairy cows has got to be good for sheep in the pasture. And so for a number of years until we finally figured it out, we were on 22-day rest periods. And it just so happened that every time we came into a new daily paddock, the barber pole worm was peaking. So that's what we don't want to do. And we've ourselves have been there and have learned the hard way that we've got to pay attention to the barber pole life cycle. We've got to learn it, first of all. And 17 years ago, we did not even know the barber pole life cycle. So we're trying to convey that to you. Always think of, when you make a management decision, think of the life cycle and how it's going to be affected by that management decision. The barber pole worm has a number of tricks up its sleeve, and one of them is periparturient egg rise. And Melinda's talked about this a little bit already, but the L4 stage larvae has the ability to go into hypobiosis, which is just hibernating. And say, like this time of year, maybe it was ingested a month ago or a few weeks ago, and it turns into the L4 larvae. It's living in the abomasum of the sheep, and depending on certain factors, it can go into that hibernation mode, and it just sleeps till about the last 2 or 3 weeks of gestation in that sheep, and then somehow it can tell that that ewe is physiologically stressed with the advanced gestation, and it wakes up. And what's it do? It starts sucking blood, and it starts making a lot of eggs, because it knows, quote unquote, through eons of years of experience, that right after lambing, that ewe's going to go out onto green pasture. And so it's just ramping up the eggs and getting ready, to cause us a lot of grief in our sheep. So this is something that occurs in all sheep and with the barber pole worm. And so we got to remember that. For an example, up to about 3 years ago, we had dewormed in the jugs, and then it got to be, really hard logistically for us to do that. And so we didn't one year. And that particular year, we lost 2 or 3 ewes in June. Usually you don't see a problem in the ewes that early. It usually takes a solid 45 days of on pasture, and we were only 30 or so before you see evidence of barber pole worm occurring. And all of a sudden we lose 2 ewes, just bingo, like that. So we went back and thought about this periparturient rise and thought, if we would have Famacha scored all the ewes coming out of before they went onto the pasture, we probably could have picked up these ewes, because they probably would have had a degree of anemia, as evidenced by the Famacha score. I wouldn't doubt that they were a Famacha 3 at the time we turned out to pasture, and then it just was a downward spiral. So we have to keep remembering this periparturient rise. Now we still don't deworm and Famacha score and deworm in the jugs, but we do when we're vaccinating the lambs at 3 weeks of age. We're running them through the race. We just check the ewes, their eyes, and see what we got there. And there's usually 10 or so out of 220 that need to be dewormed at that time. Since we've put this into practice, we haven't lost ewes out on the spring pasture. So here's how we get into trouble. These are the numbers that we're up against. Each adult worm inside the ewe does lay 5 to 10,000 eggs per day. That's a ton. So if we take a ewe that in her feces has 200 barber pole eggs per gram, that's not an excessively high number. I mean, the range is from like 50 to, I've seen as high as 9,000 eggs per gram on these ewes. So let's just take the example of 200 eggs per gram in the manure. The ewe poops out 4 pounds a day, which is equivalent to about 1,800 grams of manure. 1,800 grams times 200 eggs per gram, that's 360,000 eggs per day that ewe is putting out on our pastures. I mean, these numbers are just staggering. But to make it even worse, say you have 100 ewes out there and you're moving them daily. just say you're giving them 1 acre a day, that's 36 million eggs that those ewes are putting out on that 1 acre every day. So this is what we're up against, and whenever I can get complacent about the barber pole worm, I go back to these numbers here, and it kind of cures me right away. So that's what the problem is. So how do we get them? The easy answer is they're just there. But there's another way that we can get them that is really something to think about. We can buy them. You know, for a long time, I didn't realize that this could happen. But when we buy that nice set of ewes, or even one ewe, she's a really good looking ewe. She looks, she's got good production history behind her. We're buying 4 things. We're buying that ewe itself, what she can do. Phenotypically, we're buying her genetics. We're also buying the parasites that are in her. And almost more importantly, we're buying the management of those parasites historically on that ewe. So for instance, if that ewe came from a flock, say like ours used to be, that was dewormed monthly, and they went through one dewormer and they kept doing it because they didn't know how to solve the problem. And they went and used another dewormer. They went through that dewormer, and then they sold the ewe to me. So what I have is a whole bunch of worms in that ewe that are resistant to 2 classes of dewormers, and I just bought that. And she's going to put worms eggs out on our pasture that will turn into larvae that will be ingested by our sheep, that will not be able to be killed by 2 classes of dewormers. So it really puts me in a disadvantage, to say right off the bat. So when you're buying sheep, consider that. Ask the seller what his or her management program is for deworming, because when you buy them, you're going to inherit that program. The same thing occurs when you're commingling 2 different flocks on the same pasture. It's exactly the same thing that can happen. So we've got to watch out for these things. On dryland range, as we indicated earlier, the barber pole worm really isn't a problem unless you've got some riparian areas on that dryland range, or quite commonly out here in the West, on larger ranches, they might only have like 100 acres out of 6,000 acres that are irrigated, and the barber pole worm can certainly get going there. And a lot of times those 100 acres that are irrigated, ewes that can't make it out on the range are stuck on that irrigated pasture to help them out. Bum lambs are stuck on those irrigated pastures to give them a better go around. And then everybody's so busy with taking care of the main flock of the sheep out on the dryland range that these irrigated acres kind of get forgot about. And if we're not doing things with our grazing, all of a sudden we have problems with the barber pole worm. And it's typical of the barber pole worm. These things sneak up on you. So genetics and worms. Caleb's going to talk more about this in detail, but there's 2 things that are going on with the way that our ewes get and react to the barber pole worm. The first one is resistance, and that is an inherent or a genetic ability of the lamb or the ewe to not get infected in the first place. Or it can be their ability to manufacture red blood cells to make up for the blood-sucking abilities of the barber pole worm. Those resistance is determined by genetics almost entirely. And the other factor that we have on our pastures with sheep is resilience. And what resilience is once that sheep is infected by the barber pole worm, the resilience is the ability of that ewe or lamb to make up for it. you know, to manufacture more blood cells, or just somehow not be affected so much by the infection. One thing that we have going for us is that these parasite traits of resistance are moderately heritable. So it's about 20 to 30%, which gives us an upper leg for breeding for resistance to the barber pole worm in our sheep. So how do you know what kind of parasites you have? And I'm gonna turn this over back to Melinda after this slide, but there's a couple different ways. First one is fecal egg counts. Caleb's going to talk about these more in detail later on, but you can take a fecal sample and you can take it to your veterinarian and ask him or her to give you a fecal egg count. It's very easy to do fecal egg counts. Once you get used to it, you need a $300 microscope and some slides that are called McMaster slides and some dilution stuff. So for about $400, you can set yourself up to do fecal egg counts. Fecal egg counts, if you have your veterinarian do them, it's going to cost you usually $20 to $25 per sample. So you can pay for a $400 setup pretty fast. Fecal egg counts are also used in fecal egg count reduction tests, which basically all that does is tell you if your dewormer is working or not. You take fecal samples of, say, 10 animals right before you give them the dewormer, and you wait 7 to 10 days later, get those same animals in, do a fecal count on them again, and compare them. And if there's not a 95% reduction in the amount of eggs between those two before and after deworming, then your dewormer is technically not working anymore. So that's what a fecal egg count reduction test. Caleb's going to speak about genetic selection of resistant sheep. Fecal egg counts are very much involved in that, and fecal egg counts are also involved in the drench right assay, which is an assay that's been developed at the University of Georgia, which instead of doing fecal egg counts for all 3 classes of dewormers, you just send them a sample of your of say like 10 sheep in a combined sample, send it to the University of Georgia, and they will tell you which dewormers work and which don't in your flock. So for $450, when you consider all the labor that you're going to go through to get the same answer, it's a pretty good deal. Okay, now I'm gonna turn it over to Melinda again, and she'll tell us about what a fecal egg count looks like when you're looking at it under the microscope.
All right, so as you can see here, this would be the microscope view of the fecal egg counts, and these big black pieces are just bubbles, so you ignore those. And the smaller ones here are the coccidia. These are the ones that were the scour-causing critters, the protozoa. The Haemonchus is the barber pole worm here. So you can see that you can classify, in this case, just by size. So you can see here that we've got a handful of coccidias floating around there. So this is something that I would recommend, especially if you're just getting started with the idea of doing some parasite management, because I think it's really important before you do anything to understand where you are in your flock. If you have you know, a subsample of your flock fecal egg counts, that'll give you an idea of what do you have, how much of a problem do you have, and then you can start working towards being able to, you know, do some Famacha scoring and do some different treatments that might get you to where you need to be. And I think down here at the bottom, this link is to give you the Rhode Island fecal egg count course. So if you were to want to do what Dave said, purchase your own equipment and do this, this is a way that you can learn how to make sure you're getting what you need out of it.
Okay, thank you very much, Melinda. We're going to move on now to the next slide. Come on, next slide. Okay, so the goal of integrated parasite management, or IPM, is not to create parasite-free sheep. It's impossible to do, and we probably don't want to do it anyway. So that's not the goal. It's normal for sheep and goats to have the barber pole worm in them. For all we know, it might be beneficial to have small amounts of barber pole worm in our sheep. We just don't want to let them get out of hand, you know, and to cause disease problems and production losses. So one of those things you might hear when people start talking about parasites of any kind is the concept of refugia. And all refugia is it sets up a situation in your flock that limits the exposure of the dewormers that you're using to the worms itself. And there's a couple of things that you can take advantage of. It's been proven many times over by parasitologists for the barber pole worm that 70 to 80% of the infection is in 20 to 30% of your ewes. I mean, that's super, you know, because that gives us a chance to manage this disease and this organism that does it. The other thing that we have to remember is if you've never dewormed any of your sheep before and nobody's ever dewormed before, that dewormer that you're using, excuse me, can only kill 98% of the worms in your flock at the very best. Remember, 95% is considered, you know, a positive result. If it's less than 95%, then you better start thinking your dewormer is not working anymore. So, given these things, that most of our infection is in 20 to 30% of our ewes, and the dewormer is not going to kill all the barber pole worm. If we selectively deworm our ewes or lambs, we're going to be able to manage that population of worms. For example, if we just deworm everything, we're going to kill all the worms in our sheep except for, say, 2 or 3%. So we put those sheep out on our pasture, and if we just keep doing this for a number of years, what's going to happen? At the end of 2 or 3 years, our pastures are going to be pretty much totally populated by larvae that are not, or that are totally resistant to that dewormer that we're using, right? That's what we want to prevent. On the other hand, if we just deworm the ewes that are actually infected by the barber pole worm and let the other 70, 80% just don't deworm them, when we put that flock back onto our pastures, we're going to have a set of barber pole worms, the 2 or 3%ers that the dewormer does not get anymore. We're going to have them mating with the 70, 80% of the barber pole worms that aren't very good at their jobs. So we get a mix there between those two types of worms, that two bunches of genetics, and we have a population of worms that remains susceptible to the dewormer that we're using for a much longer time. So how do we do this? How do we selectively deworm? Enter the Famacha card. What it tells us is it tells us what animals are infected and what ones are not. And so by using the Famacha card, if we if we deworm the Famacha score 3s, 4s, and 5s, the 20 or 30 percenters, and leave everybody else go, we don't deworm them, we are in essence creating a refugia. We haven't talked about it yet, but on the scoring of a Famacha, on the Famacha scoring, a 1 is a nice red, perfectly healthy eyelid, lower eyelid, and a 5 is white. And so the range goes from red to white. A 5 is darn near dead, folks. You know, so if you've got a 5-score animal, she is in a critical, precarious position, and your chances of saving her are slim. So that's the beauty of Famacha scoring, is we can catch that animal before it gets to a Famacha score 5, and we can deworm her before she's in that precarious position. But you say Famacha takes longer because I got to score all these animals, and then I've got to deworm the ones that I need to. The quick answer to that is it does not take longer. With good facilities, you can do 125 sheep per hour, and that's just a simple race with a tub, 2 people operating, 1 person letting the sheep in, the other person Famacha scoring. And I guess it's nice to have a 3rd person recording what the scores are. But we've done this for about 8 years now, and we can do 125 sheep easily in an hour. There's a ATTRA video on YouTube that you can click on, and it just shows you how we're doing that. So it's not a pie in the sky thing. And so when you're Famacha scoring first and just deworming 20 to 30% of them, you can go a lot faster than if you just deworm every single animal. It also costs you a lot less. You know, we're looking at cost per animals of you know, $1 now an animal to deworm it, a mature ewe. And so those costs, you know, 10 years ago it was half that cost for a lot of those dewormers. So it's becoming, you know, something to consider. So if there's anything that you take away from this webinar today, just remember to Famacha first and only deworm the 3, 4s, and 5s. Things you have to remember though, there are precautions when you're doing Famacha scoring and deworming on the results, is your dewormer has to work, right? You know, if it's not working, then you can Famacha score all day long and you're still going to get dead animals. So we got to either do a fecal egg count reduction test or send some fecal samples into the University of Georgia for the drench right test, and just to check that your dewormer's working. Question often comes up, how often should I Famacha score? And it's that universal answer, well, it just depends. You know, generally speaking, your ewes are going to be susceptible to the Barber Pole Worm before weaning, from lambing to weaning, because they're under a lot of physiological stress. And your lambs sucking all that milk and having a great time on the pasture, they're usually not going to show evidence of Barber Pole Worm infection until they're after they're weaned. So taking, for example, you've weaned, and if you've got a large amount of Barber Pole infection, you probably should Famacha score them weekly, or at least every other week. If your rate of infection is relatively low, you can probably get by with Famacha scoring them after weaning for every 3 to 4 weeks. Usually, like on our farm, we score every 2 weeks, and we keep it up 3, maybe 4 times until about 3% of our lambs that we score are Famacha score 4s and 5s. So then we stop. So it just depends. You know, if you don't have much of a problem with Barber Pole Worm in your flock presently, you know, after you wean, you can probably do your lambs at 3 weeks, Famacha score them, deworm the ones that need it, and that's probably all you have to do. If you keep doing that and you see that you're getting more and more infection, then you probably better ramp up the number of times that you Famacha score. Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Whit Stewart. Whit is a extension sheep specialist at the University of Wyoming. He's one of the members of the research team on this project. Whit has a long history of being with sheep, and he's very knowledgeable. And so with that, I want to introduce you all to Dr. Whit Stewart.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone for being on. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, as Dave mentioned, the major theme of this, as we talk about options to deal with internal parasites, it's really preserving what we have. And so there's three major drug classes that we have at our disposal, which are really precious resources given the amount of resistance that have been experienced internationally and even here within the United States. A couple of really important things to understand in regards to using these dewormers or these anthelmintics is making sure that we have the right calibration on these. Obviously, not all of us have access to scales, but that is going to be pretty critical to know the body weight of the animals that we're treating so that we're providing the right dosage. Underdosing can accelerate resistance. I think the other aspect to remember is that making sure that we take time to read the label. And oftentimes we can work with our veterinarians or others that can help us interpret some of these, but oftentimes these things go overlooked, and it's always important to read the instructions thoroughly. These three drug families, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we have seen here in the Intermountain West, but they kill these parasites by starving them and messing with their neurotransmitters and their ability to move. And so these different compounds that are used have slightly different modes of action, but the three major families that we deal with are benzimidazoles, nicotinics, and macrocyclic lactones. And so what's really important to understand is as we have done research in the region and captured producer practices in the Intermountain West, we've really discovered that there's some misconceptions about what products we should be using, how we switch to new products, and so we've really tried to educate those a little bit more. I think the first important component to keep in mind is we don't move on from a dewormer until we're sure it's no longer working. That's a critical management tool. In our region, these three drug families that we have seen, we've seen more widespread use of the benzimidazoles based off the survey data with some of the studies we've conducted, and to a lesser extent the ivermectin. The nicotinics, like Prohibit especially, have been used to a much lesser extent, at least from the sample populations that we have visited with in our region. So our first class, many of us are familiar with this albendazole. It's a valvazin is the trade name. This was the most commonly used anthelmintic in our study set that we saw. Important to understand that there's a 7-day withdrawal period. That is critically important to reiterate. Always follow instructions on the label. This will help control that feeding stage of the barber pole worm. There's varying levels of activity against hypobiotic larvae. In the studies, there is some lack of agreement, but there have been reported instances where it is effective on these dormant stages. It's also very effective on other types of parasites, and that's something that I really want to reiterate. Last week, we talked about the results of our resistance study in our region. I think it's important to delineate that we are specifically talking about resistance of the Haemonchus contortus or the barber pole worm to these dewormers. It's not that it doesn't work for the other species. Our study specifically looked at that organism of interest in today's webinar. So it's important to keep that in mind. The other thing that's really important is in our region, sheep are extensively managed, not so much on our farm flocks, but oftentimes we see that if we are administering valvazin in the first part of the breeding season, that can actually mess up maternal recognition of pregnancy. And so it's really important that we don't use this product during that initial stage of pregnancy. You know, whether we're in the mid-Atlantic or southeast, valvazin or albendazoles, Safeguard is under that canopy. There's documented, published, peer-reviewed literature that suggests that there's widespread resistance with the barber pole worm. All right, again, Safeguard, similar product. I think what one of the challenges with Safeguard is that when we are allowing the animals to dose themselves or consume what they're supposed to, we've seen pretty commonly that sheep are pretty illiterate when it comes to reading instructions on the products that we use. And so I think one of the challenges with Safeguard or just administering in an oral pellet is making sure that we have the right dosage. Ivermectin, this was one that seems to be half of the populations that we sampled in our study in the Intermountain West, half of them showed that this product is still working. And this is a really good product for other classes of worms as well. It's a drug of choice for the meningeal worm, which is not extremely common in some of our neck of the woods, but definitely in the upper Midwest, they do see that more. It is effective at controlling the stage 4 larva and reported hypobiotic larva as well. It has a little bit longer slaughter withdrawal time than we see with the valvulin, but it is still important to keep that in mind. You know, for all of these, and I've even seen this on some studies reported using albendazoles, is the importance of fasting animals prior to administration. And I think, you know, if we were to speculate a little bit, and I think it's worth doing to some extent on why some of these products have not been as effective, is I think the inability to always be accurate in how we use these according to label recommendations. We could probably all be guilty of making shortcuts from time to time, and so I can't highlight enough the importance of making sure that we calibrate the dose correctly, and we also make sure to pay attention to withdrawal times, and definitely fast the animals prior to administering. Moxidectin, this was a real home run in the small data set that we collected here. And again, I refer you to University of Idaho Extension Livestock YouTube page to see last week's specific results. I won't go into those in detail today. The moxidectin is in that macrocyclic lactone category, so very similar to Ivomec. And as we've worked with the folks in the East Coast that are really well versed in some of these late-breaking parasitology challenges, they have suggested that moxidectin, even though it is working, given the similarities to Ivomec, it's probably going to show a similar pattern of resistance over time. But needless to say, 90% of the ranches that we sampled in our region, moxidectin was still effective. And Dave mentioned some of the price points associated with these products. Idectin is probably the most pricey, last estimate that we did. And so, again, very similar application, orally administered. Disrupts different neurochemical transmitters than some of the previous drugs that I mentioned earlier, but also gives you a good broad spectrum of control across other internal and some external parasites. So I think what is most important in the take home here is that we need to know what works and what doesn't. Next slide, so you can help me advance that. I'm not sure why. Oh, we'll go back to levamisole real quick. Sorry. Again, this is the least utilized in our data set. Again, we didn't sample, you know, hundreds of operations in the Intermountain West. We were funded from Western SARE generously, and we're able to do what we could. What we saw from the survey results is this is probably the least utilized in our region in the Intermountain West. Again, pretty effective in other regions still. Similar mode of action. What's important to understand with this is that it has the lowest margin of safety. And so if we are not being cautious, there's a potential to really suppress the immune system of the sheep by overdosing these. And so it's important that we make sure that we, again, follow label instructions as we mix this into solution and store it. Also, I think it's worth mentioning that this is pretty effective on lungworms. When we say probably the most effective, I'm referring to some really good studies done with the consortium in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic. This was one of the more effective drugs that they have left back there. And so I think speculating into the future in our region, given the relative underuse of this product, unfortunately, the results of our study with the drench right, there was some deterioration of the assay with this specific compound. And so we're left curious and need a follow-up study to determine how much resistance we're experiencing with this active ingredient. Although I think it's safe to speculate that it's not a tremendous amount given its overall lack of utilization across some operations. Next slide, please. This is something that we're really guilty of in our region is extra label drug use. And that's when we're using a product that is different from its label. And so that's what would constitute an extra label utilization of this. It requires a good working relationship and a prescription from your veterinarian. That rule, unfortunately, is pretty loosely followed sometimes. And I think it's something that we will have to make sure we're better stewards of moving forward, especially as we deal with these resistance issues. I will just add one anecdote from our region. We oftentimes, in our range flocks, don't have a tremendous problem with the barber pole worm or many internal parasites, just given the lack of moisture that we operate on. And I think there has been some use with injectable dewormers. Those, of course, are approved in Australia and other countries, but are not on the label here in the United States. And I know that they can be effective, but again, that's an example where if we are working with our veterinarian and have approval to use those, we rely on their training and expertise to help make sure that we're not doing something we shouldn't. Next slide. Oh, back one, please. So we talked a lot about fecal egg count reduction tests, and I'm going to take it back to the study that we did. A fecal egg count reduction test requires that you administer a dewormer, you wait 7 to 10 days, and count the resultant change in worms after you'd administered the dewormer. As you can imagine, it requires, one, keeping good records on who you treated and knowing their specific fecal egg counts, coming back and doing the same sheep. But oftentimes that's a challenge, especially in our management system. And so we are going to recommend that you do understand what products still work on your operation, but it is worthwhile understanding that it does take some time and effort to determine what's still working. For our study, we chose to use a larval development assay, which takes the stage 3 larva that Dave alluded to earlier in the pellet, is developed, and the inhibition of development in this well plate, this image you see at the bottom right-hand corner, we use that to look at all drug classes. And the larval development assay, again, is administered out of University of Georgia. It was an efficient way for us to capture a very broad range in geography and very different operations in one sampling. So you take the fecal samples, overnight it to the lab. It can be pricey, upwards of $400, but you get a complete answer without having to wait 7 to 10 days and then test all of the dewormers. So I do recommend this. This is a resource that we have, and I guess before I end my segment, I would really encourage everyone today, as we talk about integrated, we try to give good, valuable recommendations, but we also recognize that there's a diversity of sheep management out there. And it's important, I think, as a baseline to understand what products you still have on your operation that are effective. And you can't do that without doing either one of these two. So with that, Dave, I think you have the next slide, correct?
Whit, can you give us a little bit of your expertise on the non-chemical dewormers that sometimes we run up against, and also combination dewormers?
Yes. So I guess we'll go to the next slide. We talk about that to some extent, if we could advance there. So Dave mentioned a growing body of evidence suggests that combination dewormers, which takes active ingredients from each of the 3 drug classes, can be effective. Obviously, we don't have products here formulated that are combination dewormers. So right now, at this stage of the game, is administering each dewormer separately, a full dose of each dewormer separately, to help increase the efficacy of those dewormers. I'm cautious to say we all should be jumping to combination dewormers until we're absolutely sure that all the products available to us are no longer working. When I traveled to Australia, or I'm sorry, New Zealand and Uruguay last year, I was blown away to see the dewormers and the spectrum of combination dewormers that they have down in the south. Again, as I mentioned, we don't have that currently, and so it's really important that we don't try and mix these active ingredients ourselves. Rather, we administer each one individually, and that is our option for combination dewormers currently. But it has an additive effect, as you can see in this table. If as you as you increase the number of drugs that these adult worms are exposed to, the efficacy or effectiveness increases. Dave, you mentioned, going on to the next slide, there is a lot of anecdotes, and I just want to, anecdotes are those things which are strong opinions, not necessarily based on facts. And we're bound in the extension and academia world to adhere to a well-designed study that we can test statistically to tell us if treatments are working. So we hear a lot about pumpkin seeds, garlic. There's many different options out there. Diatomaceous earth is one. And what I've found as I visit with producers, again, I don't want to discredit working knowledge on the operation, but there is an overall lack of peer-reviewed, scientifically based results that those alternatives work effectively. The exception to that is some of the plant secondary compounds that we see, such as condensed tannins, polyphenolics, in things like sandfoin, birds foot trefoil, Sericea, Lespedeza. Those have shown to have some suppressive effect of development of some of these worms. But again, they are part of an integrated strategy. But again, I would highly recommend that as you work with your extension, ATTRA, your specialists, they can help you discern fact from fiction in regards to these alternatives. Is that what you were looking for, Dave?
Yes, thanks a lot, Whit. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I'll just talk about the second tool now that we have here. Jason, can you advance the slide, please? One more. And that second tool is how we can control the barber pole worm through grazing. And I want to thank you guys for hanging in there. I know we're going a little bit over, but we really want to impart all the information that we can to you. And so this second tool is a really strong tool that we can use. Remember that 80% of the worm population is on the pasture in the larval form. So there's 3 strategies that we can apply to that worm population on our pasture. The first one is give it 35 to 40 days of pasture rest between our grazings. The second one is a paddock grazing period of no more than 4 days. And the third one is then exit that paddock with 6 to 8 inches of residual. Let's just take a look at those individually. I guess I need you to advance it, Jason, please. Okay, 35 to 40 days of pasture rest. These 2 slides, the slide on the left is from our operation. This is grass that was 32 days of pasture rest. You can also see the density of the sheep that we have on that paddock. That paddock is about 7/10 of an acre, and there's 500 some head on that paddock, including the lambs. We've gone to a 40-day pasture rest now. You can see the difference in the pasture growth, and this just gives more grass out there. You know, we have more grass out there, the same maybe number of parasites, but they just can't access them quite so much. So go ahead, Jason, please. Okay, one of the key things that they found on the barber pole worm larvae, this is data out of Worm Boss in Australia. Australia and New Zealand pretty much lead the world in barber pole worm research. And you can see here the steepest line here, the one that's furthest to the left on this graph, that is what happens to a barber pole population, the survival rate at 90 degrees Fahrenheit highs. So if you have about 40 days of highs, just the highs in the summer, and you have them for 40 days, about 95% of the larvae in your pasture are dead. And the reason why they die is because these larvae, they don't eat. They have fat cells in them, and those fat cells power a wiggle. And these larvae are always wiggling, just wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. And that's how they motivate around. They need water to wiggle through. And that's why on the dry range, you don't have barber pole problems. But on irrigated or high rainfall areas, you can get them because these guys are using that water, heavy dew, to migrate by means of a wiggle. So the thing to remember is the more higher temperatures you have, the faster they wiggle, and they only have a set amount of wiggles, and then they're done. Next, please. So you can accomplish the same thing with haying. You hay a pasture, and it dries those larvae out to a degree, but the biggest thing is it heats them up, and they're just wiggling for all get out. And you normally, if once you hay and come back to pasture it, a lot of times it's about 35 to 40 days since you hayed it, and so you are in essence creating a 40-day rest cycle on your ground there. And this has worked very well. In our study, we ran into a number of producers using this technique, and they were some of the ones that had the least amount of barber pole worm infection. Please, Jason. The second thing is get out of that paddock that you're grazing in 4 days or less. And this goes back to that part of the life cycle that it takes 4 days to 9 days to for the larvae to crawl out of the sheep pellet and onto a place on the plant. So if you're moving your sheep before 4 days, you've just got out of Dodge before they can ingest those larvae. Next, please. The last thing is on your grazing strategies is exit with a 6-inch residual. This picture is taken from our pasture. This is what I consider a 6-inch residual. And how it works is because those larvae on your pasture, they're, for the most part, they're only on 2 to 3 inches away up from the ground. So if you pasture down to 6 inches, it gives you some wiggle room. Next, please, Jason. Okay, here's another picture of 6-inch residual. You know, when you're grazing, a lot of what happens is the mental picture you have in your mind to make decisions and establish targets. And this is a target that I've established on our farm. This is what I call 6 to 8 inch residual. This is when I move our sheep. If you got out there with a ruler, you'd find some grass that was 12 inches tall. You might find some grass that was 3 inches tall. But for the most part, we are not grazing down to that 3-inch level where we can ingest parasites. On a side note, you leave grass like this behind, that grass is the next day, it's growing. Can you advance 2, please, again? Okay, this is what happens on our farm, taking those 500 sheep. If we would have let them go 12 hours more from that picture that you just said in the slide before, this is what it's going to look like. Huge difference. They can eat a lot of grass in 12 hours. This is too little residual. These sheep in this picture here, they've ingested a ton of L3 larvae, and that's what we want to prevent. Next, please, Jason. Another little thing that you can do is fence line wean. This picture shows sheep ewes on the right, lambs on the left. Now, we've all gone the other way. Excuse me. And when we've weaned our sheep, we've put the lambs as far as we can from the ewes. And what happens? It's about 7 days worth of bawling, right? Lots of baths out there. Take a look at this picture. Very little baths. This picture was taken 4 hours after they were weaned. Lambs are down, got their heads down eating. Ewes have got their heads down eating. We do this for about 48 hours. And then we gently take the dog and move the lambs away from the ewes, and there is not very much complaints. So what this does is it reduces the physiological and the emotional stress on those lambs, and it's really been effective for us. I don't know of any research that's been done to validate this, but it sure works for us and the farms that I've talked to that have incorporated this into their management. As an example, before we started fence line weaning, after weaning for about 300 lambs, we dewormed about 250 times. Some of them were the same lamb over a 6-week period, and that was Famacha scoring every 2 weeks. Since we started fence line weaning, we've dewormed the first 2 weeks, we had about 18. The second week, we had about 12. Third week, we had about 10. So we've really reduced the infection rate in our flock and our lambs. So I'm just in love with fence line weaning. I just want to pass that on to you. Next, please, Jason. You can graze multiple species. Put cows in with sheep. Cows, for the most part, there is some research that says that they are affected by the barber pole worm, but for the most part, they are not. It's a dead end. So they ingest the barber pole worm and no eggs come out the back end. So that's a really nice way to kind of vacuum up your pastures. Next, please, Jason. The other thing that we can do in grazing strategies is plant these plants that have condensed tannins in them. Most notably in the Intermountain West, they're sandfoin and birdsfoot trefoil. These condensed tannins can really do some nice things out there. They stop bloat. Even if you've got alfalfa in your pasture, you got sandfoin in there, it stops them from bloating on the alfalfa too. And from a parasite viewpoint, the condensed tannins, they don't kill the parasites, the barber pole worm, they just kind of stop it from doing its bad things. And so as long as you have them on pastures that have sandfoin in them, it really inhibits the blood sucking and the egg laying capabilities of the barber pole worm. The minute you take them off though, then they start to go to work again. Also of note, sandfoin hay does accomplish the same thing. Next, please, Jason. Okay, now we're getting down to the end of things, and I wanted to introduce Caleb Pierce. He's a sheep producer in Meridian, Idaho. He's a interesting young man, very on the ball with his sheep. He markets breeding stock throughout the United States. He's got Katahdins. He also markets his lamb direct to the consumer. He works for the Idaho Wool Growers Association as a government affairs in the government affairs department and new memberships. He's the vice chair of the Katahdin National Sheep Improvement Program Committee. He owns his own sheep flock, and just so he doesn't get totally out of spare time, he also runs a podcast that's called Sheep Things Podcast. I've listened to this. There's lots of great information on it, and it's just really interesting to listen to. Okay, take it away, Caleb. You're going to talk to us about genetic selection for our sheep.
Well, Dave, thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to share with everybody here. So I want to talk a little bit about some other tools that you can use in your toolbox to manage parasites from the animal's perspective. So instead of just using management and chemicals to manage these parasites, you can also use the animals themselves and select animals that can handle them a little bit better. So, the third tool in your toolbox is culling. Now, for those of you with smaller flocks, this can be something that's hard to do. You can get kind of emotionally attached to animals, and I can completely understand that. Once an animal has a name, it is hard to get rid of. But those animals with names sometimes are ones that are also animals with lots of parasites and animals that continue to need lots of deworming. And so animals that regularly score Famacha scores of 4s and 5s, it's good practice to keep track of those. And when you have ones that are regularly scoring low, to think about culling them. If you're really attached to the animal, maybe just put it in a dry lot pen and treat it like a pet, and not with your production flock. Keep it off your pasture if you feel that you need to keep that animal, because it's likely spreading a lot of parasites out there. As was mentioned earlier, the majority of your parasites are coming from a small percentage of your animals. So if we can reduce those animals that are spreading a lot of those parasites, we will help to kind of reduce the parasitic infection in the pasture. So if you kind of can't survive your flock management and can't handle regularly those parasitic levels that you're seeing, then perhaps she's kind of holding your flock back. And then the other tool that you have, which is similar but a little bit different, is selection. So this isn't just removing the animals that don't work, it's actually actively selecting the ones that do work. And there's a few different ways that you can select, and we're going to talk about that here, about how to select. But you can select for resilience and resistance, and there's several different ways to select depending on which strategy you're going for. For selecting for resistance, you're going to want to use fecal egg counts. And fecal egg counts, as Dave mentioned earlier, can be expensive if you take them into your local vet clinic and have them do those for you. It adds up very quickly. You can do them yourself though, and that's a very cost-effective option. And you can usually get results pretty quickly then. And you can also save quite an amount of money. One way to look at it is you can typically, at least I can typically count about 5 to 6 in an hour, 5 to 6 slides, and that's not even going very fast. And so if you figure you're counting 6 slides in an hour, and if you're paying somebody else $20 per sample to do that, well, that's you can imagine you're paying yourself $120 an hour, and buying that microscope looks very like a very good strategy after looking at it that way. So there are different times that you can do fecal egg counts. So I do them both at 60 days or 90 days, depending on when I have the earliest infection, and we'll talk about that in a second, as well as after weaning, so at about 120 days. That's kind of the ideal for selection. But again, it's more labor to collect those, more time, and can be more expense. So while that's ideal, you can also typically see the largest spread in resistance for that 120-day fecal egg count. So doing it at that point also works very well. We'll talk a minute about how to compare those. And then there's also, you can see this resource here from NCAT that has some genetic selection strategies to manage the Barber Pole Worm. So that is another tool that you can use in your toolbox. A couple notes there, you'll see that you have to have a sufficient parasitic challenge. You have to have a 500 eggs per gram average. So basically you have to actually have parasites out there in a large number to be able to see the resistance. So a way I like to describe it is, if you just have beneath that, you may be seeing the difference between the animals that are primarily getting their nutrition from milk and creep feed versus the animals that are actually grazing grass. When you have above a 500 eggs per gram average, you're seeing that they all have some levels of parasites and they're all getting exposed. And then if they're all getting exposed, then you know that the ones that are going to have reduced fecal egg counts are going to be the ones that are going to be likely more resistant, because they're getting the same level of exposure. Now, obviously, you don't go out into your pasture and look at the animals and go, okay, my average today is 500 eggs per gram. You obviously have to pull samples and count those. So a quick, easy way to see if you are getting some averages before collecting samples is to look at Famacha scores. And if you have 25% of your sheep are scoring between that level 3 and level 5, then likely you're going to have some parasitic exposure. Also, if you see Famacha scores dropping pretty quickly, you're also going to be seeing likely a strong parasitic exposure. One note on that as well, 500 eggs per gram is the minimum, but it is actually much more accurate in selection if you're a little bit higher than that. So typically a 1,000 to even 2,000 eggs per gram average will give you a really nice bell curve and a really nice range of data sets to be able to select the animals that are the most resistant. 500 is kind of that minimum to give you an idea, but it becomes more accurate the higher your eggs per gram is, until a certain level. After you get to a really high level, you're likely not going to be able to see much resistance difference, because everybody's getting so many parasites. So if everybody is a Famacha score of a 5, that probably means that you had a problem somewhere in the management side of things. So to move on to the next slide here. So along those selection tools, you can select replacement ewes in your flock. So by identifying those ewes in your flock that are doing a good job, that's going to be important Famacha is an easy way to do that, but also using those fecal egg counts is important if you have that ability and you want to move that trait. Selecting rams can really move your flock forward really quickly because rams have such a genetic impact on your flock and your lamb crop and future ewe populations. Putting more importance and stress on this trait in your rams can really improve your flock over time. Parasite resistance is moderately heritable. There's some recent studies have found that it's not as highly heritable as growth might be, but it's pretty close. And so you can make some progress pretty quickly from a genetic side of using rams and over time kind of stacking pedigrees, if you will, by using resistant rams for multiple generations, and you'll likely move your flock that way. So if you struggle with parasites in your flock and you want to move your genetics forward, but perhaps don't have the time or the resources to pull fecal egg counts on all of your animals, utilizing Famacha scores on your flock, and then purchasing rams that will have some proven data to have parasite resistance, that will help to move your ewe flock average forward as you select replacements out of those options. So in order to do that, I want to share a little bit about how to build parasite resistance. So there are essentially, as I kind of hinted at earlier, two distinct traits that you can select for genetically that will help your flock fight parasites. Those are resistance and resilience. As I mentioned earlier, with resilience, you're essentially identifying the animal's ability to tolerate the parasites, whereas with resistance, you're identifying the animal's ability to fight the parasites. So I guess that distinction would be with Famacha scores, you don't necessarily see a direct correlation with fecal egg counts. There is somewhat of a correlation there, but you may have animals that have lower fecal egg counts that also have poor Famacha scores because perhaps it's just a fewer number of parasites can actually give them a greater harm than other animals. And so when you're looking at selection, you can kind of think of it as two ways, both the animal's ability to fight the infection and the animal's ability to tolerate the infection. Resilience is going to be the animal's ability to tolerate that infection, and Famacha scoring is going to measure that. That said, the two traits are related and they do work together. So by selecting for animals that can tolerate parasitic infection through Famacha scores over time, you will improve the genetics in your flock for ones that can fight the infection. And what I mean by fight is with the resistance, just as a clarification, the animal's immune system and the white blood cells will actually attack the parasites themselves and can begin to eliminate those parasites. So it's an immune system response there that we're selecting for with parasite resistance. So when you're selecting for resilience, again, it can help give you kind of a buffer, kind of a cushion, so that way you can maintain survivability if you do have high parasites. So if you have a large number of parasites out there, selecting for animals that can tolerate that is going to help you. And then also commercial producers that are not able to do fecal egg counts, that can also help with them because they can't maybe collect fecal egg counts and fecal samples on all the animals that are out in the pasture. Utilizing resilience as a tool can be important. So when looking at resistance, you're more so looking at the direct result of the direct cause, not the symptom of is this animal able to tolerate these parasites, but you're looking at does this animal actually have parasites, and focusing on the problem rather than the symptom. It can also help to reduce pasture contamination over time, because as you increase the number of animals in your flock that can directly fight the parasites themselves, you will reduce the number of parasites that are laying eggs from within the ewes, and then reducing your parasitic infection in your pastures. And then also it kind of provides a long-term solution to the problem as we see some of these dewormers begin to not be as effective. If we can select animals that are resistant to the parasites themselves, that will help us in the long term, give us just another tool in the toolbox to continue to fight this. Okay. Oops, one too many. So I'm going to go back there. Awesome, thank you. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about selecting for parasite resistance, because again, as we talked earlier, using Famacha scoring is an important way to select for resilience, and keeping records of that is helpful. There's been a lot of studies and a lot of research done for parasite resistance in different breeds. Catodons and polypays have the most amount of data, as was mentioned earlier, for selecting for parasite resistance. So the way to select for that is to use fecal egg counts. And so what fecal egg counts do, again, you can do those yourself. It's very helpful. It also provides a set of quantitative data with a large spread. So this is really helpful when moving genetic selection and making progress and helping your flock to move forward, is having actual numbers and a way to actually quantitatively measure that versus this animal performed okay, this animal performed better. Having actual quantitative data is important. Sometimes if you do decide to take it into your vet, you'll have to clarify with them that they're actually doing fecal egg counts and giving you an actual count as opposed to a low, mid, and high levels of parasites on your slide, because that doesn't give you that quantitative data that you'll need. So always clarify with your veterinarian if you're going to do that. The McMaster's technique, as Dave mentioned earlier, is the technique that's used to give you a quantitative result. And then that's the most accurate to determine parasite resistance. And so again, the reason for that is if you can select with parasite resistance, as I said, there's a lot of research and data that helps us to eliminate the nutritional and environmental factors that may take place. With Famacha, for example, you might have a single lamb that may have a lot of parasites, but perhaps he's getting a lot of milk and a lot of feed, and he's getting really good nutrition. And so he's, tolerating those parasites. So with a Famacha score, you may see a difference between him and another triplet out of a ewe that is perhaps has the same amount of parasites but doesn't have as strong of a nutritional background to help it fight those. And so you may see some differences in Famacha score there, but not necessarily differences in the resistance itself. And so this helps you kind of identify the amount of actual worms in the animal itself. So again, as I mentioned, necessary factors, you have to have 500 eggs per gram. You also have to have a range of counts. So you can't have everybody be 500 eggs per gram, because that doesn't tell you much. So ideally, the larger the range, the better. So I've seen ranges in my flock from 0 to 30 to 40,000. So having that large of a range really helps you determine which animals are really bad and which ones are really good, and helps you do that really fast. And then also consistency in collection. So just making sure that you collect everybody at the same day when you go to collect samples is an important factor to be able to utilize that data. So to talk a little bit about how to select for parasite resistance, one of the helpful tools is to use estimated breeding values. So for those of you who have experience with cattle, you're probably familiar with EPDs and estimated progeny differences. An estimated breeding value is essentially the same thing, helps you predict the performance. But the difference is it's actually measuring the value of the animal itself. So whereas an EPD is measuring, it basically takes an EBV and divides it in half, if you will, because it's what you would expect the difference to be in the lambs, just as a side note. But it's essentially the same type of technology and same type of procedures that are used to develop estimated breeding values as EPDs in cattle. So how do EBVs work? Well, essentially the goal of estimated breeding values is to eliminate the environmental factors that can cloud that actual reality of the animal's genetics based on performance. So as I mentioned earlier, the difference of a single and a triplet. Estimated breeding values help us to eliminate that through heritabilities and generations of data, and the formulas that are put into the system can help us to eliminate those environmental factors and as they often call it, nature versus nurture, to identify the nature of the animal versus the nurture it's received in its environment. So, and then by comparing animals within a group, one can kind of begin to see how that relates to the performance of other animals. So if you were to lay out the animals in a group, you would expect the traits to form a bell curve with proportions of animals statistically distributed close to a normal distribution that you would see in statistics, with a couple animals that really outperform the rest, assuming they're the good ones on the right, and then, you know, the most of them then being within one standard distribution of the average. And then, of course, with small numbers of lambs, you're not going to see a statistically perfect bell curve, but the more animals you have, the closer you'd expect that bell curve to look. So let's imagine for a second that this is your flock. Okay, well, actually, let's be honest. If any of you have had sheep for more than 1 year, your flock has probably gone from something like this to something like this. So let's imagine that this is actually your flock now. And let's imagine that each sheep fecal egg count, place them vertically within this grid. And then can everyone still hear me okay? Okay, awesome. And then as you can see, you know, you're going to have the highest proportion, there we go, of sheep that are in the, oh, that's one too far. If we can go back to the last one, that'd be great. As you can see there, you know, most of your sheep are going to fall in that center, but you're going to have a few that outperform and some that are worse. So if you can imagine that the fecal egg count reduces, moving from left to right, the sheep on the right are going to be the ones that you're going to keep as your breeding flock, and those are going to be the ones that you're going to select your rams from. So let's say you're trying to really push parasite resistance, that little guy on the far right there is probably going to be the one you're going to want to keep, and breed to move your average steadily further. So if you can imagine for a second that we take those 2.5 or 3 sheep on that left side there of the graph, and if we pull those out and we pull those out from our flock, then the average of our flock is going to shift further right. Our flock is going to become more parasite resistant. Again, we're removing those trouble animals that are causing the issue there, and I can see that the grid line somehow got a little bit shifted. So for those of you who are into math and statistics, you're probably like, wait, that graph is really wrong. And yes, I do understand that that graph is incorrect. So if you were to imagine it as a statistical standpoint, those grid lines would move over to the right. But that gives you kind of an idea of what that might look like. So now you can imagine if you didn't have that, if you didn't have fecal egg counts when you're selecting your replacement ewes, if you didn't know that the animal's fecal egg counts were, you might actually end up selecting animals on that left side of the average, and then you're moving your flock in the wrong direction and actually making your flock less resistant. So if you can identify those animals that are on the right side by taking and collecting the data, you're going to be helping move your flock over the long term. And that's where estimated breeding values can really come into play, is by identifying the actual genetics of the animals itself. So just a clarification, as I mentioned earlier, parasite resistance is moderately heritable. So that means that the animal with the lowest fecal egg count is not necessarily going to be your most resistant. Now you say, hold on a second, if that's the case, then how do I know that I'm selecting the most resistant animal? Well, with the raw data, you don't necessarily know that you're selecting the most resistant. Likely, you know that you're going to be selecting the more resistant ones, but it's not going to tell you it's the most resistant. However, when you collect that data and it's analyzed, especially when you have multiple generations of data, those EBVs that are developed can really identify the trends and consistency and begin to identify the genetics of the animals themselves. One other clarification too, one thing I hear frequently from producers is they don't want to use this technology, or that they want to use the technology, but perhaps don't sell much breeding stock, or you can't collect all that data. In either of those cases, selection pressure can still be put on purchased rams, as I mentioned earlier. You can make a lot of progress by purchasing rams that have EBVs for parasite resistance, rather than collecting all that data and submitting it yourself. Now, if you have the ability to, collecting it and submitting it yourself is helpful and will certainly help you identify animals in your own flock quickly. But if you want to do it in a way that maybe is more cost effective, putting that pressure on the rams can really help to move your flock a little bit quicker. And because that there is that moderate heritability, you will see improvements over generations. One thing I would like to point out, though, about using EBVs for genetic selection is the importance of keeping a balance. So I have here in this next slide, I have two different animals, two different ram lambs from my flock this year. And you can see those are the different estimated breeding values, or at least a subset that I received back from the National Sheep Improvement Program for the data that I collect. You can also receive a lot more, but these are the ones that are highlighted in the online searchable database. That link is there at the bottom, and I'll have it in the resources again as well. But you can see there on the left is an animal that was very strongly parasite resistant. So the way estimated breeding values work for parasite resistance is it's measured as a percentage fecal, or a percentage reduction in fecal egg count. So you can see there for the post-weaning fecal egg count, it's a negative 98.62. So basically what you can imagine is that animal is going to have about 99% fewer fecal parasites in their fecal egg count than the average of the group. So this animal specifically never got above 250 eggs per gram. He was 50 and 250 in an average of 3,000 and 2,000. So he was always dramatically below his contemporaries, and he had some resistance on his sire's side that was that as well. So that's kind of like the top 1 or 2% of the country. And so you might say, oh, this is the best sire for me to use. Well, the important thing to keep in mind with EBVs is that EBVs are a powerful tool, and they really can help you to move the genetics in your flock really fast. But you have to do so in a balance and not focus on single traits. So to compare that, the animal on the right side of the screen there is an animal. You can see he's a plus 76 there for weaning fecal egg count. So that's your 60 to 90 day range, and a 45 for post-weaning. So he was much worse than this ram on the left. But you can see he has much better milk, that maternal weaning weight number. That's a milk and mothering. You can also see he had better growth, that post-weaning weight and weaning weight. And then you can also see that combines to give him a higher level of pounds of lamb weaned per ewe, which is that US hair index, which is just a combined trait. So basically you can kind of think of each of these estimated breeding values as knobs on a stereo. You can think of like the bass, the mid, the treble. They're different tools you can use to turn up or turn down certain traits. As we all know, if you were to take if you were to take the bass, for example, and turn it dramatically up really fast, it would probably really distort your sound. It's kind of the same thing with estimated breeding values, where you don't necessarily want to turn up just one trait because you risk everything else coming down in proportion to that one trait. Moving everything gradually forward will help you. So if you want to, for example, the ram on the left, he has decent, prolificacy is just a little bit above a 0 number of lambs born, which means he's going to average a little bit higher than twins. So if you want to just kind of stick with consistent twins, growth just kind of moderate, milk and mothering instinct kind of moderate, but parasite resistance is really high, that helps you to move that trait forward a lot faster with that animal on the left. But if you need more growth, if you need more milk, then perhaps that animal wouldn't be the right one to get, and perhaps you'd want one that has a little bit higher milk or higher growth and is maybe lower in parasite resistance, but more of a balanced animal. So just when you're using EBVs, keep in mind that they are very powerful and they will help you move those traits forward very quickly. And with that with great power comes great responsibility, as has been said. It's kind of the same thing with genetic selection. With that power that you have with estimating breeding values, you just have to be careful that you don't overlook traits that you need in your flock and that you select animals on a balance. And then there at the end, I've got some helpful resources. So the National Sheep Improvement Program produces these estimated breeding values. So for those of you familiar with cattle, you're probably used to the fact that typically the breed associations handle those estimated progeny differences. With sheep, they're all done through the National Sheep Improvement Program for all breeds. So you can access the resources there. That first link will give you, take you to their page that has a lot of explanation on each of the traits. Second one there, as I mentioned, is that searchable database where you can put in criteria. So for example, if you're trying to find animal-specific EBVs, again, to maintain that balance, you can use that search function there, or also to look up specific animals, like you saw in that last example where I put in their specific IDs. That third one, that is the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control that Dave mentioned earlier. Very, very, very helpful research and very helpful resource for a lot of different topics on parasites. That tab there will take you to the tab on genetic selection. And the last one there as well has a link for a document that's a blueprint for selection of parasite-resistant sheep for Katahdin specifically. Katahdins have kind of more data than most breeds do, and so that's why I put that link in there. And then also, if you have any questions, you want to learn more about EBVs, you can explore those there, or feel free to contact me. Feel free to call me, or my email address is Caleb, that's C-A-L-E-B, at idahowoolgrowers.org. And that's plural, Idaho Wool Growers, and all one word, .org. And I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. Happy to help you out if you have any questions. And with that, I think that finishes up my portion. And thank you all for bearing with me through that explanation.
You're muted, Dave.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My little headset thing is acting up. So we've covered a lot of ground today, and I thank you for sticking with us. And just in a short summary, there's a couple questions that we just want to think about. The first one is can worms overwinter? They certainly can. And how do they do it? Most of them are overwintering in your ewes. So remember that, and the things that happen in that ewe, and how you can, that those parasites are overwintering. A lot of those L4s are going into hyperbiotic state, and so they're going to reappear when you start lambing again. There's not very much overwintering done on our pastures, but there's a lot done in our ewes in the Intermountain West. Should I ever deworm without Famacha? I hope you all say a resounding no. You know, I have not run into a case yet. Even if I bring animals onto my place, I Famacha them first, and I deworm the ones that need it, the 3, 4s, and 5s. I don't do everybody, you know, because if you do everybody, you're going to get the very worst critters out there in the worm population, and you're going to start putting those larvae on your pastures.
Dave, I might add one thing real quick.
Yeah.
To that. You know, it's important to keep in mind that Famacha is pretty specific for some of those roundworm species that do cause anemia. One example that probably Famacha isn't going to tell you a whole lot is the nematode iris issues for the most part. And so that's going to be earlier in the season, but that goes back to integrating Famacha with fecal egg count results and speciation or coproculture results that tell you what kind of species you have. And because again, you very well may be missing some of those important parasites. So I would recommend in tandem with good parasitological results.
Yeah, thanks, Whit. That's really important, and particularly if you're bringing animals into your flock. We've had some results this last summer that people have gotten some bad problems with parasites, and turned out they weren't Barber Pole Worm at all. They were nematodirus, and they were imported in from Western Washington. So as Whit says, it's a really good idea to find out what kind of parasites you have first. Besides famaching first, what are the most important deworming rules? The first one is to administer the dewormer correctly, knowing the weight of the animal, getting the right dose. And the second one is use one dewormer until it quits you and then start another one. What are the most two powerful long-term tools to manage the barber pole worm? You guessed it, grazing and genetics. So we can use those two tools to propel us into the future, even after we don't see any more development of the dewormers, because there's probably not going to be any. So that being said, we'll just take a few questions. We'll answer any that are not answered today with emails, but here's a good one. Which dewormer is most effective on hypobiotic larvae? And can you help us with that, Whit, please? Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Are you there, Whit?
It looks like Whit is gone.
Okay, well, I'll answer that one. And ivermectin is probably the most effective on hypobiotic larvae. All dewormers are somewhat, but the ivermectin class is the most effective. Here's another one. It says grazing under irrigation seems to be a challenge, but what about grazing on hay aftermath once the irrigation is stopped? And yes, that's a great way to kind of limit the barber pole population, especially if you wait 2 or 3 weeks after the irrigation is stopped. So you're giving those a chance for those L3 larvae to a greater proportion of them to outwiggle themselves and die. The third one is that we'll take in is what is the life expectancy of the barber pole worm? We didn't cover that. That's a great question. The parasitologists at the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control tell us it's about 7 to 8 months. So you can see without that hypobiosis that's going on, we wouldn't have a lot of worms overwintering in our sheep. So we're going to move on now because we are getting a little late, but we will answer any questions that you guys have that we've had in the question box with emails. And so we're going to go on now to what you've all been waiting for, and that's the Famacha video. If you could start it up, please. It's about 5 minutes long. We'll view it, and then we'll take any questions on it.
And then what I usually do is have you guys seen those conference things that have the alligator clip? I get one of those and modify it so this sticks in it. And I clip it right to my shoulder thing, arm thing there. And that gives me 2 free hands. And so what you do is you remember that it's cover the eye, push, pull, and pop.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so what it's attempting to do is to just cover pull. And if you do that, a lot of times what can happen is that necessitating membrane still covers the mucous membrane, and so you get a lighter reading.
You don't get them to curl up, you're not pushing hard enough. And it doesn't hurt them. See how when I push, they curl up, and then you pull and pop.
This girl's a 1. Go ahead, Bobby.
When you say pop, what do you mean pop? You're pushing the eyeball down a little bit?
No, you push, then you cover, push, pull, and then pop is when you just pull down on the low eyelid more. Yeah, right. Ideally, if you get it to pop, the tissue, see how it pops like that? Versus like that. And that's good. That's just what you want. It's better if you do it in direct sunlight because the colors are a little bit easier. But really, come on now, you know, you work with what you got, you know, and that applies to your own place too. But, so what you don't want to do is just put your hand there and then pull there. This girl, it really isn't making much difference.
Oh.
No, it doesn't. But that's a good point though, because they can have two different colors sometimes.
Can they really?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, explain that.
Oh, I was kidding.
I don't know why. But if you're if you're on a 4, usually
Check the other.
I check the other eye.
Okay,
You
good
know?
to know.
Yeah.
It's
So
like your blood pressure can
And
be
you
different.
can't
from
leave
one
it
end to the
exposed
other.
for too long, right? Because doesn't it
That's
change
a good
colors?
nurse thing.
if it's
yeah.
exposed to the air?
Yes. What you want to do is make a snap decision. You know, and if you make enough snap decisions, you get better and better and better. But don't just kind of go 3, 3.5. Cover, push, pull, and pop. Yeah, she's
That's still 3.
right there.
Damn, honey, you're
Just get your right hand around the neck, and then come with your left hand, and with your right thumb, you're covering and pushing, and the left thumb, you're pulling and popping. It's a lot easier to do that than try to do it with one hand. The sun is, in back of you, you're shadowing the ewe's head, so it's better to do it at the time of day where the sun is directly into the sheep, if you can. That's another one of those things that's, sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't. Okay. She's a 1 or a 2. She's okay. She's good. Okay. What are you doing?
I'm pushing down,
Cover first.
push, and pop.
Pull and pop. Okay, what is she?
She's got to be a 1.
You bet. Good girl.
Get your head, you get the sheep.
Right.
Get your head. Okay.
Okay, now with your right hand, pull. With your left hand, put your thumb there.
Oh.
There you go. And then you can pull and pop with your right hand. Okay. Gotta push harder here. There you go.
Oh, there.
There you go. Okay.
Oh,
What is it?
That's, what, I'm looking at the dark. I'm seeing a 5 or 4.
No, you got it. It's nice and pink, right?
Yeah.
It's a 1. See,
That's what I meant.
Yeah. Okay. Now there you go. Remember, you're gonna pull and pop with the left thumb.
Okay.
Okay. So cover.
I wasn't paying attention to that. Oh, good.
And Henry, what you can do is, yeah, that's it. Bend that ear back. Cover. Okay, you got to cover the whole eye. There you go. Okay, great. Perfect.
2 or 1.
Yep. Good job. Let's just, one thing I wanted to say that I forgot to is on the grazing. I was encouraging to rotate before the 4th day comes up on your paddocks. I didn't mean to sound too cut and dried there, because if you want to go away, if you want to go on vacation for a week, that's fine. Just give them a week's worth of grass and come back. When you come back, then go back to your regular moving them every 4 days or every 1 day or whatever you want to do. It's not like the end of the world, so you've got a life too, and the sheep basically have to fit around you.
I think you're muted again, Dave. There you go. No, but we still can't hear you.
How about now?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So you guys, do you have any questions on that Famacha scoring technique? I think, Marianne, can't they just ask right out?
We would have to unmute them. If they raise their hand, then we
Yeah.
can unmute them and they can ask.
Yes. Okay. You might have to help me, Marianne.
I've got it up.
Okay. Any questions on that technique? What we're going to be doing is we're going to give you guys a Famacha scoring card, but what we're going to ask you first to do is send me a video, Dave Scott at ncat.org, of you actually showing the technique with a sheep or a goat. And once we get that technique, straightened out and you show me the right way to do it, then I will send you a Famacha card. And we have 40 Famacha cards that this project has set aside. And the first 40 that send in a video to me and they get it right, I'll send them a card. After 40, it's probably going to cost you about 20 bucks to get a card. I should mention too, these cards, they need to be out of the sunlight, you know, so put them, they're going to come with an envelope. When you're not using them, put them back in the envelope, put the envelope in a desk drawer somewhere so it's out of the sun. What you don't want to do is close up shop and put the card right on the desk or the top of your pickup on the glove box or something, because it'll fade for sure. So do we have any questions, Marianne, or anything's coming in?
Yes, we have one question from, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Irina. You can speak. Irina, are you there? I see you're trying to speak, but nothing is coming out. Okay, we will come back. Kathy Perillo?
Yeah, could you explain what cover really means? Like, I wasn't 100% sure on that one.
Sure. Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, what cover means is you take your thumb and you go at right angles to the eye opening. So that's the best way to do it. So you come from the top of the head of the sheep down over the upper eyelid, and that's covering. And then the next step is to push down. And the best way to know if you're pushing down enough is you want to have those eyebrows curl up. That's the sign. If you don't have those eyebrows or the eyelashes, excuse me, the eyelashes curling up, then you're not applying enough pressure. And it's that pressure on the top eyelid that pops out, you can pop out the lower eyelid that way. So did I answer your question well enough?
Kathy, was that good enough?
So. I think so. I think it's one of those things like you kind of have to do it to know if you're doing it.
Yeah, your whole thumb should cover that eyelid, that upper eyelid. And advance your thumb over the upper eyelid, coming straight over the top of the sheep's head, so that your thumb, if you just figure the eye opening in itself is going east and west on the face, and your thumb is covering the upper eyelid from the north to south. There's another video that we're going to have in the narration of these slides, this PowerPoint, and all the notes to every slide is going to be up on the ATTRA website on Monday. And on that narration, there'll be a link to another, or even I think it's going to be on the website, on the PowerPoint itself. There'll be a link to another video showing Famacha scoring, and you can use both of these videos to kind of get you in sync there. If you have any questions at all, just give me a call, and I can certainly try to help my best on that. Any other questions, Marianne?
Yes, we have Robert, but you're self-muted, Robert. You might have to unmute yourself. I would probably slaughter your name, Minchhofer. I don't know if you can unmute yourself or not, but it's saying that you're self-muted. Okay, sorry about that. If you wanted to type your question, Robert, in the questions pane, he could look at it there. Otherwise, there are no more questions. No more hands raised anyway with questions.
Okay. Well, the final thing I'd like to say on this Famacha scoring is it does take some practice. It looks fairly easy, but when you actually get out and do it, it's not quite as easy as it looks. And so it'll take some practice. And the other thing is, until you've done a few thousands of these things, you better use your card. You know, and every spring when March, April, when we start lambing in April and we start Famacha scoring ewes after 3 weeks postpartum, I take out my card and get my eyes calibrated again, because it's pretty easy to sort of forget about the shades of red to pink. Everybody can tell white, but telling a 1 and a 2 from a 3 sometimes is a little bit hard unless you've done it a ton of times. And for me anyway, I have to recalibrate my eyes every year on it. So it's a good, if you're just have a flock of like 50 animals, I would pin that Famacha card to my arm and just use it all the time. That way you don't go wrong on it.
You do have one more question from Dave Brink.
Hey everyone, I was wanting to know if it's pretty much the same technique for goats.
Yes, Dave, it is. It's exactly the same technique.
Okay, perfect.
And for alpacas and llamas.
We don't talk about them.
Yeah, yeah. But it all affects those 3 classes of animals, but it's exactly the same technique. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions, Marianne?
Nope. No
Dave,
one.
One question from email. A follow-up question to the alternative dewormers, pumpkin seeds, garlic, those kind of things. Again, I just reiterate, there may be some late-breaking studies that have maybe proven efficacious, but I have not seen those yet. And so I guess that's where really knowing fact from fiction in terms of whether it's been published in a reputable peer-reviewed journal, I think that helps. But also really taking time to read the paper, and there's ways to access those papers. If you find something online and you can work with your local land grant institution to get those journal articles, oftentimes they're not open access. That's a way to do it. I know that's a cumbersome way to have to access an article, but for many producers, if they do want to read it, or if you want your extension person to synthesize it or review it and tell you if it's valid, that's another good way to do it. So I think that's important that we strive for research-based information, and sometimes the research trials haven't been conducted yet, and so there's opportunity to answer some more questions. So we by no means have all the answers, but we have to make sure we delineate fact from peer review or from fiction.
Yeah. And what a good example of that is there's a product out there now called Dewormer, and it is a nematode, which is a roundworm trapping protozoa or fungus, excuse me. It was developed in Australia. It's just now making its way to the United States. And what this fungus does out on the pastures, it just collectively collects all those larvae you have out there, and then they're not able to, and then it eats them, so they're not able to be ingested. It's a very new biotechnology, and there's numerous universities, is particularly in the southeast, that are doing research on the effectiveness of this biowormer now, and so we are really interested in seeing the results. The one downside is it's expensive, so we're kind of waiting for those universities to give us some hints and some guidelines on when use of biowormer would be the best, economic thing to do. So,
you do have one more question, Dave,
okay.
from let's see, from Brianna Henderson. And it says she's self-muted, so you'll have to unmute yourself, Brianna. Okay, well, I guess she could also type in her question in the questions pane, and you could answer it later.
Okay, great. I think we're time to wrap up. I really thank you for hanging in there, everybody. And if you have any further questions, contact myself, Whit, Melinda, or Caleb. Our contacts are in the slides. I also want to tell you, remind you again that this webinar PowerPoint will be on the ATTRA website. Just Google ATTRA and search for Integrated Parasite Management sheep, and it'll be there. And so both the PowerPoint and the written notes to each slide will be there. So we're hoping that this can be a really good resource for sheep producers and goat producers too. And with that, I think we'll sign off, and I really want to thank our presenters, and most of all, want to thank you for tuning in. Thanks very much.